Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. As a reminder, you can listen to this and every other SleepWise story completely ad-free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, settle in as we drift into a world that lies beneath the surfaces we touch every day. A world that rarely announces itself, yet quietly keeps our modern lives stitched together. In the soft glow of your bedside lamp, you might notice the small familiar objects around you. A phone resting on the table, the quiet hum of an air conditioner, a watch you slipped off before lying down. Each one feels simple, almost weightless, yet inside them is a journey so long and intricate that it spans continents, climates, and decades of human ambition. As you settle deeper into the pillow, the story opens slowly, like a map unfolding in dim light. We begin with a question that appears small, but stretches far beyond the room. What are the materials that make all of this possible? The glass on your phone, the magnets in its speakers, the copper threads carrying current through the walls, all of them come from minerals that once rested deep in the earth, hidden in silence for millions of years before someone dug them free. These are what the world now calls critical minerals, the essential pieces of technology that modern societies rely on, yet whose supply can be fragile, concentrated, or easily unsettled by distant events. We pause here, letting the idea settle gently. Lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earths. Names that sound almost lyrical when spoken slowly, though each one carries a different story of geology and craft. Some help store energy in the batteries that guide electric cars along quiet roads. Some make magnets so strong and compact that they power everything from wind turbines to the tiny vibration motor that wakes your phone each morning. Some simply help electricity flow reliably from one point to another, forming the quiet circulatory system of the digital age. In this first quiet moment of the journey, imagine these minerals not as commodities or headlines, but as travelers. They begin as scattered atoms inside ancient rock, then are uncovered by miners who trace patterns in the land, following clues left by long-extinct oceans and shifting continents. From there, they will move through refineries that transform rough stone into shimmering powders and bright metals, places where chemistry becomes a kind of slow alchemy. But before we reach those steps, we stay a little longer in this room, noticing how effortlessly technology surrounds you. Every light, every sound, every connection is a reminder that the world has built extraordinary systems to find, extract, process, and shape these minerals into forms we barely think about. And tonight, as the room grows quieter, we will follow those pathways gently, from raw earth to refined material, from distant landscapes to the calm stillness of where you rest now. Far beneath the surface of deserts, mountains, and old seabeds, the story of critical minerals begins long before anyone names them. Layers of rock settle over ages, oceans rise and disappear, and heat from within the earth gently rearranges elements into new forms. These minerals were never meant for technology or industry. They were simply the Earth's slow, patient work. Yet modern life has grown inseparable from them, depending on their quiet properties in ways we rarely notice. In simple factual terms, critical minerals are materials that economies rely on but cannot easily replace or secure. Most national lists include lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, graphite, and a family known as rare earth elements. What binds them together is not just scarcity, but concentration. A few countries control much of the mining. Even fewer handle the refining. And when any single step is disrupted, entire industries feel the effect. This fragile pattern is what makes these minerals critical in the eyes of policymakers and manufacturers alike. We walk through these ideas slowly, letting them settle. Lithium forms in shimmering salt flats and in hard rock deposits across continents, but only becomes battery-ready after complex purification. Cobalt is mostly mined as a byproduct of copper in Central Africa, then transformed through chemical steps that turn raw ore into a stable compound for batteries. Graphite, though common in nature, must be purified to extremely high levels before it can store energy. Rare earths exist widely, yet separating them from one another requires long chains of solvent baths and careful chemistry, making the process expensive and difficult to replicate. Imagine standing at the edge of an open pit mine at dawn. The air is cool, and the first light brushes the terraced walls of stone. Here, huge trucks move slowly along carved roads, carrying broken rock toward nearby processing plants. Inside those facilities, crushers reduce the stone to dust, and water or chemicals pull valuable minerals away from the waste. What begins as rough, heavy ore gradually becomes something more refined. Powders, concentrates, and liquids that look nothing like the rocks they once were. But mining is only the first act. The deeper transformation happens in the middle of the supply chain, far from the drama of excavation or the shine of final products. It is here that minerals are purified, separated, and shaped into forms that manufacturers can use. This stage demands skill, infrastructure, and patience, and it is this stage, more than mining or assembly, that quietly defines who controls the world's essential materials. And tonight, as we drift toward the next part of the journey, we will begin to see how one nation recognized this truth early on and built an entire strategy around mastering the steps between raw earth and finished technology. Tonight, we drift into the quiet world beneath the surface of the sea, where light fades into dusky blues and the hum of the world above becomes a distant memory. In these still waters, far below the restless waves, we begin a slow journey into the history of machines built to vanish into silence. Their story begins not with the sleek nuclear vessels of today, but with the uncertain calm that settled over the world at the end of the Second World War, when nations looked to the oceans for a new kind of protection. As the dust of conflict settled, the oceans held their own secrets. Sunken hulls, abandoned bases, fragments of technology scattered across distant coasts, and among them, a single breakthrough that changed everything. The German type Vorherr submarine, captured almost intact by the Allies, lay quietly in dry docks and naval yards, its steel still echoing with the war that had created it. Engineers from the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom walked slowly around those cold, unfamiliar shapes, realizing that they were standing before something decades ahead of anything they had built themselves. You can imagine the quiet rooms where these discoveries unfolded, charts unrolled across long tables, engineers leaning close to study battery arrays, hydrodynamic hull curves traced gently with fingertips, and propulsion systems that seemed to whisper possibilities. The war was over, but the rivalry that followed, the long, steady competition for technological advantage, was just beginning. And in those first months of uneasy peace, each country carried home its own captured submarine, like a puzzle box, whose pieces had to be understood before anyone else solved them. These vessels were faster underwater than on the surface, a reversal of every submarine before them. Their smooth, elongated hulls slipped through water with unprecedented grace, and their electric power allowed them to remain submerged for long stretches, creating a kind of vanished presence that navies had never known. Many historians believed that this single design laid the foundation for the modern submarine age. But in this story, we will not follow the currents of rivalry or conflict. Instead, we will drift gently along the quieter thread. How these ideas, refined over decades, led to the creation of nuclear-powered submarines, vessels that could disappear beneath the ocean for months, moving silently in the deep, maintaining a strange and peaceful equilibrium above. Tonight, as we begin this journey, we travel not through tension or urgency, but through curiosity. We follow the faint glow of history beneath the waves, where engineering met imagination, and where the world's quietest guardians slowly took shape. Imagine dawn breaking over a remote mining region, where the air feels thin and cool, and the land stretches out in muted colors. The rhythm of mining begins slowly, long before the sun climbs high. Trucks idle in gentle hums, workers move deliberately between equipment, and the first blasts echo softly through the early light. Mining, at its core, is the art of separating what is valuable from what has no use, and this simple idea drives a process both ancient and modern. Exploration determines where a mine should be dug, but mining itself begins with removing layers of rock to reach the ore body. In open pit mines, huge terraces are cut into the earth, each step revealing another layer of stone that has waited for ages. Blasting loosens the rock, and trucks haul it to crushers, where it is broken down into smaller pieces. From there, mills grind the ore into fine powder, creating the texture of soft sand. But the real work happens in processing plants. Here, minerals are coaxed from the powdered rock using a blend of water, chemicals, and density differences. Copper-bearing rock may be floated in bubbling tanks, Rare earth ores may dissolve into solutions that carry their elements away from impurities. Lithium brines may be pumped into vast evaporation ponds where sunlight slowly concentrates their salts. Each mineral follows a different path, shaped by chemistry and geology. Mining produces a material called concentrate, a dense mixture that contains the valuable mineral but remains far from usable in industry. To become part of a battery, magnet, or circuit, it must undergo refining, a long, patient transformation that removes impurities and reshapes the mineral into a stable, high-purity form. This midstream stage is where skill, infrastructure, and investment matter most, and where subtle differences in expertise can determine who truly controls a supply chain. As the sun rises over this imagined mine, we see the scale of effort required to free these minerals from the earth. Every ton of ore moved, every drop of solution processed, represents a step in a journey that most people never see. And it is here, in these dusty edges of the world, that the story meets its quiet turning point. Understanding that mining is only the first chapter, while true influence lies in what happens after the ore leaves the ground. Tonight, the story turns gently toward the transformation that happens after mining, a stage neither dramatic nor visible, yet more decisive than any other. Once concentrates leave the mine, they enter refineries and chemical plants that feel more like laboratories, scaled to enormous size. Inside them, the materials that will one day power phones, vehicles, and turbines are slowly purified, separated, and reshaped into forms that technology depends on. Refining is the heart of the supply chain. To turn lithium concentrate into battery-grade lithium chemicals, companies dissolve, filter, and crystallize the mineral through controlled chemical reactions. To refine cobalt or nickel, plants remove impurities in a sequence of steps that require precision and constant monitoring. For rare earths, the process is even more intricate. Separating each element from its neighbors can involve dozens or even hundreds of solvent extraction stages, each one nudging the mixture into greater purity. This work demands extensive infrastructure and is costly, energy-intensive, and environmentally challenging. Many countries historically hesitated to build these facilities, wary of the pollution and capital required. As a result, refining capacity did not spread evenly across the globe. Instead, it clustered where government supported it, where labor and power were cheaper, and where long-term industrial planning viewed these processes not as burdens, but as strategic assets. Narratively, imagine walking through a quiet refining complex. Tall tanks rise like columns, connected by thin pipes that glisten with morning condensation. Solutions swirl behind closed vessels, and faint mechanical rhythms echo across the grounds. Workers move unhurriedly, checking gauges and adjusting valves. A single batch of material may spend days or weeks here before emerging in its final, high-purity form. This is the invisible center of modern technology, the place where raw minerals truly become usable. And it is here, in this often overlooked middle stage, that one nation saw an opportunity decades ago, a chance to build expertise, scale, and control in ways that would quietly reshape the flow of global trade. As we drift toward the next chapter, we begin the slow turn toward that nation's long, deliberate rise. As we drift deeper into the story, the landscape shifts gently toward northern China in the late 20th century, a place where quiet hills and dusty plains hid mineral deposits that the world had not yet learned to value. It is here, in regions like Inner Mongolia, that rare earth elements lay scattered beneath the soil, waiting for someone to see their future importance. At the time, these minerals were not central to global technology. Their applications were still emerging, and only a few countries had begun to understand their potential. China, however, approached the sector with a long, patient view. During the 1980s and 1990s, the country began building expertise slowly, step by step. Government-backed geological surveys mapped deposits, universities expanded research programs, and small mining operations grew into larger enterprises. Policies encouraged production. Export incentives made Chinese minerals attractive to global buyers, and low operating costs allowed Chinese firms to sell at prices other producers struggled to match. Bit by bit, competitors in the United States and elsewhere scaled back, unable to justify higher-cost operations in the face of cheaper Chinese supply. Yet China's rise was not only about mining. The country recognized early that the true leverage in critical minerals lies in processing and refining, the stages where raw ore becomes a usable ingredient for industry. So, investments flowed into chemical separation plants, metallurgical research, and training programs focused on rare earth chemistry, a field notoriously difficult and labor-intensive. While other countries debated environmental constraints or shifted attention to other sectors, China built capacity quietly, accumulating skill and infrastructure that would later prove decisive. Picture this moment not as a dramatic turning point, but as a slow sunrise. Small facilities expanded. New refining lines were added. Engineers refined their methods. At first, the world barely noticed. Rare earth demand remained modest, used in small volumes for electronics and specialty applications. But the foundation was being laid for something far larger. By the end of the 1990s, China had become the dominant global producer of rare earth minerals, not through a single breakthrough, but through steady, deliberate growth. The country supplied most of the world's raw rare earths, and its refining capabilities were beginning to outpace those of other nations. What the world saw as a niche industry, China treated as a strategic opportunity, one that would intertwine with the rise of electric vehicles, renewable energy, and advanced electronics in the decades ahead. And so the story pauses here at the edge of this early chapter, ready to follow how small beginnings would ripple outward, shaping supply chains that now touch almost every part of modern life. Tonight, we move into the early 2000s, a period when global trade began to shift in ways that quietly reinforced China's growing role in critical minerals. As the world became more interconnected, companies sought lower costs, faster production, and predictable supply. China, already home to expanding industrial zones and a rapidly improving logistics network, became the natural place for manufacturers to set up operations. These years followed China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, a moment that opened the door to deeper integration with global markets. Manufacturers from Japan, Europe, and the United States increasingly outsourced refining, component assembly, and later full product manufacturing to Chinese partners. What began as a search for cost efficiency gradually became structural dependence. If a battery maker, a magnet producer, or an electronics company built a supply chain anchored in Chinese refineries, moving that supply chain elsewhere became difficult, sometimes impossible. This shift was not only economic, it was also practical. China was creating what economists call industrial clusters, regions where mining, refining, component manufacturing, and research facilities sit close together. A rare earth refinery might stand within a short drive of a magnet factory. A lithium processing plant might supply a nearby battery facility. In such an ecosystem, knowledge flows easily. Transportation is smooth, and companies benefit from proximity to both materials and skilled workers. Imagine these clusters as living organisms, slowly expanding as new factories join the landscape. Steel frameworks rise from empty fields, chimneys appear on the horizon, and rail lines extend toward ports. Workers who once knew only mining learn to operate chemical processes. Students graduate from new engineering programs tailored to these emerging industries. Over time, the system develops its own momentum. As the decade unfolds, global electronics begin to rely on this ecosystem. Smartphones, laptops, motors, and renewable energy components all draw from supply chains that run through China's refining and manufacturing centers. Meanwhile, the West closed down many old refineries, discouraged by tighter regulations, higher costs, and thin margins. Few realized how quickly the balance was shifting. By the end of the decade, China was no longer just a supplier of raw minerals. It had become the primary location for the entire supply chain. And because the midstream stage dictates who controls the final flow of materials, China's role in the supply chain was no longer peripheral. It was central. In this quiet evolution, we see how global trade patterns, once simple and diverse, began converging toward a single hub. The world did not choose this path all at once. Rather, it drifted into it, step by step, drawn by cost, convenience, and the quiet stability of a growing industrial giant. Now the story turns toward the stage where China's strategy becomes unmistakable, revealed not just in mining or trade, but in the scale of its refining capabilities. Today, China processes the majority of the world's rare earth elements, much of its graphite, and a substantial share of global lithium, nickel, and cobalt. These numbers are not accidents of geology. They are the result of decades of investment, planning, and refinement of industrial skill. Imagine standing inside one of the country's large refining complexes. Rows of metal towers rise against a pale morning sky, their surfaces catching the faint glow of new light. Steam drifts in slow, soft plumes. Conveyor belts and pipes carry materials from one stage to the next, each step nudging impurities away. The air smells faintly of minerals and heat. Workers check valves and monitors with calm familiarity, part of a system that has run continuously for decades. In factual terms, China's dominance in refining stems from several intertwined factors. First, the country built enormous capacity, allowing it to process minerals at a scale unmatched by any other region. Second, it perfected the chemistry, especially for rare earth separations, through years of trial, research, and government-backed support. Third, China accepted the environmental burdens that other countries resisted, enabling cost structures that kept its facilities competitive even when global prices fluctuated. Refining is where minerals gain their final identity. Lithium becomes lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, the ingredients of battery cathodes. Graphite becomes purified material for anodes. Rare earth concentrates become oxides, then metals, then magnets that will spin inside electric motors. By mastering these steps, China positioned itself at the choke points of modern technology. But this dominance was not only about science or infrastructure. It also came from the quiet logic of supply chains. Manufacturers prefer stability, and China offered exactly that. Predictable output, integrated facilities, reliable shipping, and a workforce trained for each stage of production. Once companies built their factories around these inputs, the entire system reinforced itself. A magnet maker relied on a Chinese oxide producer. An EV battery plant relied on Chinese lithium chemicals. A turbine manufacturer relied on Chinese rare earth metals. As we drift through this imagined complex, we begin to see how refining became the core of China's influence. Mining may start the journey, and manufacturing may finish it, but refining is the quiet middle where the value and the leverage truly crystallize. And in this calm understanding, the path forward becomes clear. The world's technologies flow through these corridors not by coincidence, but by design. Tonight, we follow the quiet journey of a single atom, a way of seeing the modern world through one small traveler. Imagine a speck of lithium beginning its life in a salt flat high in the Andes, where thin air drifts over pale blue pools, and mountains rise like ancient guardians. Beneath these shimmering surfaces lies brine rich in lithium, drawn upward from aquifers through slow, patient pumping. Over months, sunlight evaporates the water, concentrating the mineral until it forms crystals ready for processing. In another part of the world, in Australia, hard rock lithium is blasted from deep pits, crushed, and refined into a concentrate that glints like powdered stone. But the story truly begins when this lithium leaves the mine. Much of it travels across oceans to China, where the next stages of its transformation unfold. Here, the concentrate or brine product enters refineries that convert it into lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, high-purity chemicals essential for battery cathodes. These plants use controlled reactions, filtration, and crystallization to raise purity until the material is ready to store energy inside a cell. Once refined, the lithium flows into battery cell factories, many of which sit near the refineries themselves. In these vast, quiet halls, powders are mixed into slurries, coated onto thin metal foils, dried, and cut into shapes that will become the battery's heart, stacked and wound into form. These cells eventually make their way into electric vehicles and consumer electronics around the world. Even when mining occurs elsewhere, in South America, Australia, or parts of Africa, the refining and cell manufacturing often remains centered in China, reinforcing a supply chain that has grown familiar and deeply interconnected. This imagined lithium atom could follow other paths as well. It might join with nickel and cobalt in a high-energy battery chemistry. It might become part of a stationary storage system supporting renewable power. It might end up inside a phone you hold gently as you fall asleep. But whatever its destination, the journey almost always passes through refineries and factories along China's industrial belt. As we linger on this quiet progression, the broader pattern becomes clear. Critical minerals rarely travel directly from mine to product. They pass through an intricate sequence of steps, each one shaping their identity. And because most of these steps sit within China, the country has become the quiet architect of the systems that store, move, and deliver energy in the modern world. Our single atom, drifting through vast landscapes and silent factories, shows how global technology depends not only on geology, but on the deliberate choices of nations that built the infrastructure to refine the materials of the future. Now the story widens toward Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, regions where new chapters of the mineral journey unfold. These landscapes, varied and vast, hold deposits that have drawn interest from mining firms around the world. Yet, over the past 2 decades, Chinese companies have played a particularly active role, investing in countries whose mineral wealth is rich, but whose industrial infrastructure may be limited. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, cobalt and copper lie beneath humid forests and red earth. Much of the world's cobalt, a key ingredient in many battery chemistries, is mined here, often as a byproduct of large copper operations. Chinese companies have invested heavily in these mines, securing long-term supply agreements and, in many cases, ownership stakes. Ore from these regions frequently travels to China for refining, where it is processed into high-purity cobalt chemicals used in batteries. Further east, Indonesia has emerged as a central player in nickel, a mineral crucial for high-energy battery cathodes. The country holds some of the world's largest nickel reserves and, with Chinese partnership, has rapidly built a network of smelters and processing plants. These facilities use energy-intensive methods to convert nickel ore into material suitable for battery production. Much of this output also flows into China's industrial ecosystem, strengthening the integration between the two nations' supply chains. In South America, lithium-rich brines in Chile and Argentina, along with Australia's hard rock deposits, increasingly serve the global EV market. Chinese firms have invested in several of these operations, helping bring projects online and securing a portion of their future production. Although the mining occurs abroad, the refining and final chemical processing often take place inside China, once again drawing the value-added stages back into its industrial network. Imagine these partnerships as threads weaving across oceans. Ships depart from ports in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, carrying ore or concentrate toward refineries thousands of kilometers away. In return, investment flows back into those regions, building infrastructure, roads, and ports that support long-term supply agreements. What emerges is a global web, not accidental, but shaped by decades of strategic planning and patient investment. By building relationships where mineral wealth is abundant, and by reinforcing those ties with processing capabilities at home, China created a system in which raw materials from across the world ultimately converge within its industrial core. And as we drift through this understanding, the path ahead becomes clearer. Supply chains are not simply maps of geology, but stories of connection, policy, and deliberate design. Tonight, we turn toward the quieter reasons why so many countries stepped back from refining and processing, even as demand for critical minerals grew. These reasons are not dramatic. They are slow, practical, and rooted in the everyday choices nations make about cost, regulation, and industrial focus. Refining critical minerals is complex and often environmentally burdensome. It generates waste streams that require careful management, consumes large amounts of water and energy, and demands sustained investment in equipment and skilled labor. In many Western countries during the late 20th century, environmental regulations tightened and labor costs rose, making refineries increasingly expensive to operate. At the same time, global markets were becoming more open, and cheaper imports from abroad met industry's needs without requiring domestic facilities to remain competitive. Companies made rational choices based on cost. If a Chinese refinery could produce the same material at a lower price, firms simply bought from China. Over time, local refineries closed or shifted focus, and expertise in complex chemical separations faded. In some cases, governments assumed that if minerals were ever needed again domestically, the capacity could be rebuilt. Few anticipated how deeply integrated global supply chains would become, or how difficult it would be to reestablish midstream operations once they had disappeared. Imagine a refinery standing quietly at the edge of an industrial town. Years ago, smoke rose steadily from its stacks, and workers moved through its corridors with practiced ease. But as market forces shifted, activity slowed, equipment aged, and investment dwindled. Eventually, the gates closed, and the skills that once filled the facility drifted away with the workers who moved on to other industries. Across the world, similar scenes played out, not suddenly, but gradually, as choices made for economic efficiency reshaped entire sectors. Meanwhile, China continued to invest, refine, and expand. As Western facilities shuttered, Chinese plants grew larger and more advanced. By the time the world recognized the centrality of these processes for electric vehicles, renewable energy, robotics, and more, much of the refining capacity sat firmly within China's borders. This chapter of the story is quiet but essential. The world did not lose refining capability through crisis or neglect, but through steady shifts in economics and policy. And as the next segments unfold, we will see how moments of tension revealed just how dependent global industries had become on a single nation's industrial core. As the story moves into the 2010s, the world begins to notice the shape of its dependence, not through sudden shocks, but through subtle moments that ripple across industries. These moments act like gentle reminders, small tremors that hint at the complexity beneath modern technology. One such moment came when China introduced export quotas on rare earth elements. Though modest in scale, the restrictions caused prices to spike and exposed how concentrated the supply chain had become. Manufacturers of wind turbines, electric motors, and consumer electronics felt the impact quickly, realizing that even minor disruptions could unsettle entire sectors. Another episode occurred when environmental inspections in China temporarily shut down refineries, slowing the flow of separated rare earths and graphite. These pauses, though short-lived, sent quiet signals around the world. Imagine being inside a factory that relies on rare earth magnets for its products. Machines operate smoothly. Workers assemble components with familiar rhythm. Yet upstream suppliers begin to warn of delays or rising costs. The change is not dramatic, but it is enough to reveal a vulnerability. If a single link in the chain falters, the entire system slows. These moments sparked broader reflection. Governments commissioned studies on supply chain risks. Companies sought alternative suppliers, only to discover that few existed at scale. Some nations explored reopening older mines or restarting refineries, but found that expertise, environmental approvals, and infrastructure had withered over time. The cost of rebuilding capacity, both financial and technical, proved far higher than expected. Meanwhile, global demand for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced electronics continued to rise. Each new technology depended on minerals that were refined primarily in China, reinforcing the same pattern even as countries sought to diversify. In this gentle realization, the world began to see its supply chains clearly, not as abstract diagrams, but as living systems shaped by decades of choices. And as awareness grew, so did efforts to respond. New policies, incentive programs, and strategic partnerships designed to balance reliance with resilience. Yet even as these efforts unfolded, the structure of the global mineral ecosystem remained largely intact, with China at its center. Tonight, we pause at this point of recognition, a moment when the world understood, perhaps for the first time, how deeply its technologies depended on processes far from view. The next chapters will explore how nations began to adapt, seeking stability in a world built on materials that travel long, intricate routes before reaching our hands. As we drift further into the story, the world's supply chains begin to reveal themselves not as straight lines, but as networks shaped by decades of quiet decisions. We explore how trade patterns slowly converge toward China, creating a system where minerals, components, and manufacturing all flowed through a single industrial heart. Imagine a long chain stretching from a mine in South America or Africa, winding through ports, sailing across oceans, and arriving at an industrial cluster in coastal China. The journey feels natural, almost effortless, because every link is already prepared. Refineries able to handle the mineral, factories that can transform refined material into components, and nearby producers ready to assemble the final products. Manufacturers prefer predictability, and this structure offered exactly that, a reliability built over time, reinforced by skill, capacity, and cost. This convergence was not simply the result of policy. It was also shaped by something economists call learning by doing. The more China refined rare earths, lithium, graphite, and other minerals, the more efficient those processes became. Costs declined, output increased, and expertise deepened. For a manufacturer comparing suppliers, the choice became clear. Buy from a region where capability is proven and expanding, or rebuild similar capacity elsewhere at far higher cost. Shipping patterns evolved alongside this logic. Bulk carriers moved steadily between resource-rich regions and Chinese ports, tracing predictable routes that became the arteries of global trade. Containers then carried finished products outward again. Electronics, batteries, magnets, motors, creating a circular flow that touched households and industries worldwide. Even companies that never intended to rely on China eventually did, simply because their suppliers were already woven in. Imagine a simple electric motor inside a household appliance. Its magnets might rely on rare earth oxides refined in Inner Mongolia. Its copper windings may come from smelters connected to Chinese wire manufacturers. Even if the motor is assembled elsewhere, the quiet imprint of China's refining system remains within it. This is how dependence grows, gradually, quietly, through efficiency and habit. By the early 2020s, this pattern became deeply entrenched. China refined the majority of rare earths, processed most of the world's graphite and held significant shares in lithium and cobalt refining. Battery manufacturing, a cornerstone of the energy transition, was clustered heavily within its borders, supported by a vast network of cathode and anode producers. Tonight, as we observe this slow convergence, the supply chain begins to feel less like a set of transactions and more like a carefully grown ecosystem, one that rewards proximity, stability, and scale, and one that the world now seeks to understand with greater clarity as it plans its path forward. Now, the story widens into a soft, numerical portrait of the present day, a way of understanding China's central role not through dramatic headlines, but through the quiet clarity of scale. Numbers, spoken gently, can be grounding. They reveal shapes and proportions that are hard to see in daily life. Yet they define how our technologies take form. Today, China refines the vast majority of the world's rare earth elements. It processes most of the world's graphite, a mineral essential for battery anodes. It produces a large share of battery-grade lithium chemicals and significant portions of global nickel and cobalt intermediate products flow through its refineries. These materials then feed into manufacturing hubs where battery cells, permanent magnets, electric motors, and countless electronic components are produced. Imagine this as a map where lines converge toward a central point. Mines in Australia, South America, Indonesia, and Africa ship their concentrates along familiar routes toward coastal Chinese ports. From there, materials enter refining complexes that operate continuously day and night. Inside these facilities, powders and solutions move through long sequences of chemical steps, gradually becoming the high-purity inputs required for modern technology. Then, in nearby factories, those inputs transform again. Cathode and anode materials take shape as fine powders with carefully engineered structures. Magnets are pressed, sintered, and shaped for turbines and motors. Battery cells are assembled in climate-controlled rooms where machines move with rhythmic precision. Manufacturers build on one another's presence. A cathode plant near a battery factory, a magnet producer near a motor plant. The ecosystem strengthens itself simply by existing. Yet numbers also reveal what China is not. The country does not control all the mining. Lithium from the Andes, nickel from Indonesia, cobalt from the Congo, and rare earth ore from Australia and Myanmar all feed global markets. But where mining is scattered, refining is concentrated. And this concentration quietly defines influence. The country that performs the midstream steps shapes the flow of materials that follow. Imagine standing at the edge of this map, tracing the pathways with your eyes. You begin to see that the centrality of China's role is not merely a statistic, but a geography of capability. It is the result of decades of planning, investment, and learning, all layered into a system that supports the world's clean energy ambitions and digital infrastructure. Tonight, we hold these numbers gently, not as warnings or judgments, but as reflections of how the world has organized itself. They allow us to see the present clearly so that the next chapters, diversification, resilience, and adaptation, can unfold with understanding. As the story continues, the world begins responding to the quiet concentration of refining and manufacturing within China. This response is steady rather than sudden, shaped by the recognition that energy transitions, digital systems, and national strategies all depend on supply chains that reach across oceans. Countries seek not to unwind global trade, but to balance it, to build resilience alongside efficiency. In the United States, initiatives encourage reopening domestic mines, funding new refineries, and supporting battery plants that can operate at commercial scale. Projects in Nevada, North Carolina, and California explore lithium, rare earths, and graphite. Incentives under new industrial policies aim to bridge the gap between early development and full-scale production. Meanwhile, partnerships with allied nations aim to secure friendly sources of minerals and share refining capacity. Europe follows a similar path. The continent has launched programs to support critical mineral projects, expand recycling, and build battery factories under the banner of strategic autonomy. Countries like France, Germany, and Sweden explore ways to revive midstream capabilities, often with environmental standards that reflect Europe's priorities. Recycling plays a central role, viewed not only as a way to reduce waste, but to reclaim key minerals from used batteries and electronics. Elsewhere, Australia strengthens its position as a major mining hub, while encouraging domestic processing of lithium and rare earths. Canada develops partnerships to supply materials to North American and European markets. Japan and South Korea diversify their sourcing and invest in new technologies to reduce reliance on scarce minerals. Across the world, nations revisit policies shaped decades ago and adapt them to a new era of electrification. Imagine these efforts as lights slowly illuminating different parts of a map. None shines as brightly as China's long-established clusters, but together they form an emerging constellation, one built on cooperation, shared risk, and the understanding that supply chains can no longer depend on a single anchor. These initiatives will take years to mature, rebuilding refining capacity, training skilled workers, and navigating environmental approvals all require time and patience. Yet there is momentum. Countries speak of reshoring, resilience, and strategic supply chains, terms that would have seemed abstract only a decade ago. New partnerships form between miners, refiners, and manufacturers across continents. And slowly, the global system begins to adjust, not by replacing existing structures, but by adding new ones beside them. Tonight, we observe this shift with calm curiosity. The world is not turning away from interdependence. It is learning to balance it, preparing for a future where the next generation of technologies rests on supply chains that are broader, sturdier, and better understood. Now, the story turns toward the deeper undercurrents shaping the future of critical minerals, a world where geology meets geopolitics, and where nations reconsider the role these materials play in their strategies. We explore these ideas gently, without alarm, noticing how policies emerge from the quiet recognition that minerals influence energy, industry, and national security. In many regions, governments have begun to introduce measures known broadly as resource nationalism. Countries rich in minerals once exported raw ore with little processing, but now increasingly seek to keep more of the value at home. Indonesia, for example, restricted the export of unprocessed nickel to encourage smelting and refining on its own soil. Chile and Bolivia evaluate new frameworks for managing lithium resources. African nations renegotiate mining contracts, aiming for greater participation in downstream stages. These policies reshape global supply chains, sometimes slowly, sometimes with surprising speed. As more countries insist on local processing or new ownership structures, companies adapt their investment plans. New smelters rise in Southeast Asia. Battery factories emerge in North America and Europe. Trade routes shift, creating new patterns of cooperation and influence. At the same time, environmental and social expectations evolve. Communities near mines demand cleaner operations and greater transparency. Regulators push for technologies that reduce waste and emissions. In response, companies explore new processing methods, from direct lithium extraction to solvent systems with lower environmental impact. Recycling grows in importance, promising a future where more minerals circulate within closed loops rather than being dug endlessly from the earth. Imagine standing on a hillside overlooking a new mining region. Machinery moves below, but the scene feels different from the past. Permitting processes are more rigorous, water use is monitored closely, and community agreements are woven into the project's foundation. The mineral remains the same, but the world around it has changed. These shifts, taken together, create a new kind of complexity. Supply chains that were once defined by efficiency now balance cost with resilience, geography with politics, and speed with environmental responsibility. China remains central, yet the global system gradually diversifies, shaped by new incentives and emerging opportunities. Tonight, we hold this complexity without judgment. It reflects a world learning to manage the materials that power its ambitions, not in haste, but through careful adjustments. And as the story approaches its final chapters, we return to the objects beside you, the quiet reminders of how far these minerals travel before they reach your hands, and how the world continues to reshape the pathways they follow. As we drift into the next part of the story, the focus softens toward the landscapes and communities shaped by the search for critical minerals. Every mine, refinery, and factory rests upon a place with its own rhythms, its own people, and its own histories. And tonight, we explore these quieter dimensions, the environmental and social currents that run beneath the global supply chain. Mining, even when carefully managed, alters the land. Open pits reshape hillsides, and underground shafts trace deep, branching pathways through the earth. Processing plants draw water, energy, and chemicals to separate minerals from rock. Some regions have struggled with polluted waterways, dust, and tailings that require long-term stewardship. These are challenges not unique to any single country. They appear wherever minerals are brought from deep time into the demands of modern life. In China, rapid industrial growth brought remarkable capability, but also left environmental scars. Several refining areas faced soil and water contamination, prompting closures and stricter regulations in recent years. Across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, local communities navigate the tension between economic opportunity and environmental protection. Some welcome the jobs and infrastructure. Others worry about the legacy that extraction may leave behind. Imagine standing beside a river near a mining town. The morning air is cool and the water carries its familiar sound, though sunlight reveals traces of sediment stirred by nearby activity. A child walks with a parent along the bank, pointing at machinery in the distance. For them, the mine is both a source of livelihood and a presence that shapes the rhythms of daily life. These human stories, though seldom mentioned in figures and forecasts, are woven into every ton of ore and every refined mineral. Recycling and circularity offer a gentler path forward. Batteries contain valuable lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite that can be recovered. Magnets hold rare earth metals that can be separated and reused. Though recycling today captures only a fraction of these materials, its potential is vast. A future where minerals flow repeatedly through the economy, easing the pressure on new extraction, lies quietly on the horizon. This chapter of the story does not offer easy answers. It simply shows that the journey of critical minerals is not only industrial, but deeply human. It touches landscapes shaped by ancient geology and communities shaped by present-day choices. As the world seeks cleaner technologies, it also seeks cleaner methods of obtaining the materials behind them. And so, the path forward becomes one of balance, a slow alignment between what we need and how gently we can gather it. Tonight, the story turns toward the future, not in a speculative or hurried way, but in a calm exploration of possibilities already forming in laboratories, policy rooms, and long-term plans. These are ideas that may reshape the mineral journey, softening the pressures of scarcity and dependence, and creating a more balanced global system. Imagine a world where lithium extraction uses far less water, relying on direct methods that draw minerals from brine without vast evaporation ponds. Several companies and research groups are pursuing these techniques, hoping to reduce the environmental footprint in regions where water is precious. Battery chemistries, too, are evolving, Some designs use less cobalt or none at all. Others reduce reliance on nickel, shifting toward abundant materials like iron and phosphate. Each innovation eases pressure on certain minerals and distributes demand more widely across the periodic table. Recycling moves quietly into the center of this vision. As millions of electric vehicle batteries reach the end of their life in the coming decades, they will represent one of the largest above-ground mineral deposits in human history. Facilities are being built to recover lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite from used cells, often with energy footprints far smaller than mining. In time, this closed loop may become a significant source of supply, supporting the energy transition without drawing as heavily from the earth. Diversification also plays a role. New mines in Australia, Canada, and parts of Europe aim to supply markets closer to home. Emerging refineries in the United States and Southeast Asia are designed to process graphite, lithium, and rare earths outside China's traditional center of gravity. Each project adds another node to the global network, gradually widening the map. Imagine tracing this future supply chain with your finger. The lines no longer converge so sharply toward a single point. Instead, they branch outward, connecting multiple regions through a gentler, more resilient pattern. No single country dominates every stage. Instead, different regions specialize in different steps, creating a mosaic of capability. Yet even in this future, China remains a vital part of the system. Decades of expertise and infrastructure cannot be replaced overnight, nor would the world benefit from losing them. The aim is balance, not separation. A world where collaboration becomes more reliable because it no longer hinges on a narrow set of choke points. Tonight, we hold this future lightly, as one might hold a distant lantern. It is not fixed or certain, but it shines in a direction shaped by careful thought, innovation, and the simple desire to create systems that endure. As the narrative begins its gentle return to the room around you, we follow the journey of critical minerals back into the everyday objects that surround modern life. The phone on your nightstand, the laptop resting nearby, the car quietly charging outside. Each contains a small constellation of elements that traveled through deserts, mountains, refineries, and factories before settling into their final form. Imagine, for a moment, opening your phone and looking not at its screen, but at the invisible pathways inside it. Copper threads carry signals and power. Tiny magnets made from rare earth metals guide speakers and vibration motors. Lithium-ion cells hold stored energy, ready to respond to your touch. Glass strengthened with minerals protects the surface you swipe. Plastics derived from hydrocarbons and additives bind it all together. Each part of the device tells a story that began long before it reached your hands. Now imagine an electric vehicle parked outside a home on a quiet street. Its motor relies on powerful magnets built from neodymium and dysprosium. Its battery draws on lithium, graphite, nickel, and manganese. Its wiring is rich with copper, stretching through the chassis like veins. Even the charging station feeding it may contain components shaped halfway across the world. Modern transportation rests on mineral systems far more complex than those of the past. In the room where you rest, light moves softly across the objects near you. A lamp, a speaker, a thermostat, an appliance in the next room. Each carries the fingerprint of global supply chains that stretch across oceans. Some minerals came from the Congo, some from Australia, some from Chile or Indonesia, and many passed through refineries in China before becoming usable materials. These journeys are silent now, hidden within the smooth surfaces and familiar shapes of everyday life. And yet, knowing their stories brings a kind of quiet appreciation. The world has woven extraordinary systems to gather materials from ancient stone, refine them with careful chemistry, and shape them into tools that light our homes, connect our conversations, and help us move from place to place. These systems are vast and intricate, yet they serve us so seamlessly that we rarely pause to notice them. Tonight, we do notice. We see the hidden threads that bind distant landscapes to the objects resting at arm's reach. And in this recognition, the room feels both smaller and more connected, a place where global journeys come gently to rest. Tonight, the story settles into its closing silence, returning to the stillness from which it began. The world of critical minerals, with its faraway mines, vast refineries, and intricate supply chains, now feels less like a distant abstraction and more like a quiet presence woven into the fabric of modern life. We have traced the journey from buried ores to refined materials, from efficient industrial clusters to the objects resting gently beside you. As the narrative softens, imagine the entire supply chain as a long ribbon stretched across the earth. One end begins in the deep past, where geological forces shape the minerals we depend on. The ribbon travels through regions rich in resources, through ships crossing the ocean, through refineries glowing under early morning light, and through factories where powders, metals, and circuits take form. It reaches your home softly, slipping into your devices, your transportation, and the countless tools that support your days. Throughout this journey, China played a central role, not through a single decision or moment, but through decades of investment, learning, and the slow accumulation of capability. Other nations played their parts too, supplying ore, advancing technologies, and now working to diversify the pathways forward. The global system that emerged is neither accidental nor fixed. It is the product of choices made over years, reflecting the balance between cost, capability, and the needs of a changing world. Imagine now the objects closest to you, the soft glow of a lamp, the faint outline of a phone, the quiet hum of a charger. Inside them, minerals once held by mountains and ancient seas now rest in stillness. Their long journeys, shaped by geology and human intention, have ended in this calm room where you breathe slowly and evenly. The story of critical minerals is not one of urgency or fear, but of connection between distant places, between past and present, between the earth and the technologies that guide our days. As you sink deeper into rest, the world feels a little wider yet more familiar. The pathways of minerals become threads of understanding, gently woven into your thoughts. And now, as the final quiet moment unfolds, the story fades into the warm darkness, inviting your mind to drift softly toward sleep. Good night.